Anna, Carl, Sigmund. My claws are the claws that cut the mind. In the film Logan, we learn that Wolverine naturally grows a full beard, which means that for the rest of the X-Men and Wolverine films, he was grooming himself so that he could look like this. Since Wolverine's hair grows at an accelerated rate, he must have been grooming himself daily. But why would he spend so much time in front of a mirror with a beard trimmer in order to give himself a particular look? Well, as we saw in an earlier installment of the franchise, young Wolverine was born in the 1800s to the wealthy landowners John and Elizabeth Howlett. Wolverine's birth name was James Howlett. One evening, poor Wolverine hears a bang and rushes downstairs to find that his father has been shot to death by the groundskeeper. The scene causes Wolverine's mutation to manifest, and he murders the groundskeeper with his bone claws. Tragically, it turns out that Wolverine's mother, Elizabeth, has had an affair with the groundskeeper, who shares these dying words.
He wasn't your father. Son.
Notice the groundskeeper's appearance. His name? Thomas Logan. Wolverine spent more than a century grooming himself to resemble his biological father, whom he had killed. He finally stopped the grooming sometime before the events in the most recent film, presumably after he had gained complete control over Professor X, a father figure who, ironically, was much younger than Wolverine. And yet he continued calling himself Logan. Seems we never really grow out of childhood trauma. Neither do prophets. In our last session, we discussed some of the psychological research on the impact dead or abusive fathers have on the religious beliefs of their children. The evidence shows that history's most prominent atheists and skeptics tended to have dead or abusive fathers or father figures during crucial periods of psychological development, and that history's most prominent theists tended to have close relationships with their fathers or father figures during the same period of life. Further evidence shows that the theists had far more positive relationships as adults, suggesting that abuse or abandonment by a father or father figure during childhood has a negative impact not only on a person's understanding of God, but also on future relationships in general. We then turned our attention to one of history's most famous orphans, Muhammad. Shortly after his birth, Muhammad was sent to live with a foster family in the desert. A few years later, he was taken away from his foster family and returned to his mother, who died when he was just 6 years old. His grandfather was the next to take him in, but his grandfather died 2 years later. Custody of Muhammad then fell to his uncle, who was too busy to pay much attention to young Muhammad, at least until Muhammad was able to help out with the caravan trade. So Muhammad wasn't just orphaned, he was repeatedly orphaned. He was a serial orphan. And our knowledge of psychology allows us to predict some of the adult characteristics of a serial orphan. But it also allows us to do much more. It allows us to help Islam's greatest scholars understand Allah. Now, later in this series, we're going to discover what Allah actually is. Spoiler alert, Allah is the suppressed subconscious of Muhammad. For now, however, I'm more concerned with the fact that because Muslim scholars don't understand psychology, they don't understand Allah according to their own religion. They try to understand Allah's intentions, but their ignorance of psychology leads them to false conclusions. Perhaps an example will help. Take Sheikh Yasir Qadhi. Sheikh Qadhi has spent many years studying the life of Muhammad, and he's lectured on Muhammad's childhood experiences.
So the Prophet's father passes away when his mother is pregnant with him. And his mother barely has 2.5 years really to take care of him and nourish him, because he was being taken care of by Halima as well. And then when the Prophet is barely 6 years old, he loses his mother and his father.
Moreover, Sheikh Qadhi draws attention to the psychological impact of these childhood experiences. For instance, even the adult Muhammad broke down in tears when he visited the grave of his mother.
They say that the Prophet ﷺ found a grave over there, and he sat down and he cried like we had never seen him cry before. Until his lihya, his beard, which is, mashallah, it is narrated the Prophet had a very big beard. His beard was wet with tears.
Muhammad, when he was more than 50 years old, was so troubled by something that had happened when he was 6 years old that he sobbed until his beard was soaked with tears. Can we say that Muhammad's repeated losses as a child had a significant psychological effect on him?
The fact that the Prophet ﷺ obviously is crying in this manner, I mean, we don't need to mention this is his mother. Really, it doesn't need to be mentioned the love that he must have felt and the pain that he must have endured at the death of Amina.
But keep in mind that from an Islamic perspective, Allah really, really loves Muhammad. At times, Allah seems to have nothing better to do than to give Muhammad anything he wants. Even Muhammad's child bride Aisha noticed this. One day, after Muhammad received one of his morally convenient revelations, Aisha said to him in Sahih al-Bukhari 4788, "I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your wishes and desires." So Allah loves Muhammad so much that he hastens to satisfy Muhammad's desires, and yet Muhammad was repeatedly orphaned as a child. The question that arises for Muslim scholars then is, why would Allah, who spent so much time satisfying Muhammad's desires as an adult, not satisfy Muhammad's childhood desire for a mother and a father?
Why did Allah Azza wa Jal put 3 orphan situations, 3 traumatic trials, one after the other, upon our Prophet?
The attempts of Muslim scholars to answer this question are a kind of theodicy. In the philosophy of religion, a theodicy is an attempt to explain why God, who's all-powerful and perfectly good, would allow various kinds of suffering in the world. An Islamic version of a theodicy would be an attempt to explain why Allah, who's all-powerful and loves to satisfy Muhammad's desires, put Muhammad through so much childhood trauma.
Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put so much trials and tribulations on the young child? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will such a difficult childhood?
Sheikh Qadhi offers several explanations, but all of them are wrong. He claims that Allah repeatedly orphaned Muhammad so that he, Allah, would be the one who cared for Muhammad.
Like Allah says about Musa alayhi salam in the Quran, وَاصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي, I was the one who took care of you. Allah Azza wa Jal took care of our Prophet ﷺ and took this responsibility directly.
But this is just nonsense. Muhammad was taken to the desert where a wet nurse from the Banu Sa'd cared for him. Then his mother cared for him until she died. Then his grandfather cared for him until he died. Then his uncle made sure that he didn't starve to death until Muhammad could start working. Where is Allah in all of this? Now, of course, you can say, well, Allah is providing for Muhammad through all of these people. But you can say the exact same thing about children who have 2 wonderful parents. How are wonderful parents not a blessing from God? So how does repeatedly orphaning Muhammad make Allah more of a caregiver to Muhammad? Apart from this, Allah's miraculous care goes completely unnoticed. By the time Muhammad starts receiving revelations when he's 40 years old, he thinks he's demon-possessed. So what did Allah ultimately accomplish by caring for Muhammad by taking away everyone who was close to him?
Allah has a plan. Allah has a plan.
Sheikh Qadhi also claims that Muhammad was orphaned so that he could be sent to the desert to learn excellent Arabic. The Arabic of the cities was regarded as corrupted because the city dwellers picked up too many foreign terms and so on. But the Arabic of the desert was pure, and this is what Muhammad learned.
Another benefit of this is that this facilitated the Prophet's being raised in the Banu Sa'd so that he could become the most eloquent of the Arabs.
3 problems here. First, sending babies to live in the desert for a while was a custom of the rich. Muhammad only ended up being taken there because one of the desert wet nurses who came to Mecca couldn't find anyone else and was ashamed to go back without a baby. So Allah didn't need to orphan Muhammad to have him sent to the desert to learn Arabic. Wealthy parents would have done that, as even Sheikh Qadhi admits.
In fact, this was a custom of the elite of the Quraysh. It was a custom of the nobility of the Quraysh.
Second, Muhammad was only in the desert for a few years. He was around 4 years old when he was sent back to his biological mother in Mecca. Sheikh Qadhi's theodicy requires us to believe that Muhammad became history's greatest master of Arabic at the ripe old age of 4.
And it is well known that the Prophet ﷺ spoke the best Arabic, and in fact there is a hadith to this regard as well, that Allah has blessed me with the most succinct, the most precise of all speech.
Third, Sheikh Qadhi's claim actually backfires against the main argument for the truth of the Quran. The Quran's central argument is that any chapter of the Quran is so wonderfully written, no other writer can match its Arabic prose. But if Muhammad was history's greatest master of Arabic, no one would be able to match his Arabic, right? So even if the Quran were truly unsurpassable, which it isn't, but even if it were, we could just attribute this to Muhammad's unsurpassable Arabic eloquence, couldn't we? In other words, Sheikh Qadhi should be making the exact opposite claim here. He should be arguing that Muhammad's Arabic was awful and that the Quran's Arabic is wonderful, and therefore that the Quran couldn't have come from Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad's Arabic is apparently better than the Quran's Arabic. Sheikh Qadhi regards Arabic with foreign words as impure.
Now the Arabs viewed the language of the cities as being corrupted. The Arabs viewed the city language as being changed. Why? Because what happens to any language, it gets influenced by other cultures.
But the Quran contains numerous foreign words. So if Muhammad, as a toddler in the desert, learned pure Arabic, uninfluenced by foreign vocabulary, and the Arabic of cities like Mecca is corrupted because it's been influenced by foreign vocabulary, and the Arabic of the Quran has been influenced by foreign vocabulary, then the Arabic of the Quran is corrupted and is inferior to the Arabic of Muhammad when he was a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old's Arabic was superior to Allah's Arabic. Better luck next time, Sheikh Qadhi. The only remotely plausible theodicy here would be some form of what's called a soul-building theodicy. Soul-building theodicies claim that God sometimes allows suffering because suffering can make us better, more virtuous people. Being in dangerous situations, for instance, can produce courage. Going through various trials can build endurance, and so on. So, how does being repeatedly orphaned make one a better, more virtuous person?
Being an orphan gives you many qualities that the Prophet ﷺ would need later on in his life. And when our Prophet ﷺ is deprived of a mother and father, automatically this makes the child more independent. It makes the child more mature, gives him wisdom. Also, going through these difficult times makes you understand and experience firsthand poverty, ruthlessness, living in a harsh environment, and generally speaking, this makes you more sensitive. By going through this traumatic time, our Prophet ﷺ developed that fondness, that softness, that mercy, that tenderness for not just orphans, but all those who are weak, and this is a necessary requirement for being a prophet. Once again, our Prophet ﷺ is going through tough times in order to be compassionate, in order to be merciful. And that is why there are so many ahadith about taking care of orphans. Our religion has it as a central pillar to take care of the orphan. And our Prophet ﷺ was an orphan. There's a divine wisdom. Nothing happens except that Allah has a plan behind it.
My goodness, listening to Sheikh Qadhi, we might conclude that the best thing we can do for our children is abandon them. They may not like it, but it'll turn them into strong, independent, mature, sensitive, compassionate people. Now, what's wrong with Sheikh Qadhi's claim that Allah needed to destroy so many of Muhammad's early relationships in order to make him mature and sensitive and compassionate? Well, there are multiple problems. One, Allah had Muhammad's heart miraculously cleansed twice during his life. Once when he was a child and once when he was an adult.
There is no other more relationship because Jibreel took it out. هذا حظ الشيطان منه. He took it out. And then he washed the heart in a golden cup of Zamzam. This incident of taking the heart out and washing it occurred one more time, almost 45 years later.
Now, if your heart is miraculously cleansed of sin, aren't you going to be compassionate towards orphans? Did Allah really need to go the extra mile by orphaning Muhammad over and over again? 2, the Quran repeatedly commands Muslims to show kindness to orphans. Since Muhammad obeyed Allah's commands perfectly and had his heart cleansed of sin, wouldn't he have been compassionate towards orphans without being repeatedly orphaned? Also, if Muhammad was compassionate towards orphans due to his upbringing, and the Quran puts special emphasis on caring for orphans, doesn't the Quran once more seem like it comes from the mind of Muhammad? Here again, Yasir Qadhi should have argued that Muhammad's upbringing made him cold and ruthless towards orphans, so that the Quran obviously must have come from somewhere else. 3, as we'll see in a future installment, Islam was detrimental to orphans because Islam abolishes adoption. Adopting an orphan into your family is one of the most loving and humane things you can ever do. But Allah and Muhammad abolished this practice so that Muhammad could have the wife of his own adopted son. So Allah clearly cares more about Muhammad's sexual gratification than he cares about orphans. 4, Sheikh Qadhi radically distorts and misrepresents the impact of orphanhood on childhood development. There are negative impacts on education, as one study reports. The effect of a parent's death on children's education has been found to be severe. Children lose school time even before parents die. Many drop out of school. A higher proportion were too young to understand this negative experience, which unfolds more and more as they grow older, thus plunging them into deeper levels of depression. Orphanhood has a negative impact on IQ. Even though being raised by a foster family helps diminish this impact on girls, it doesn't diminish the impact on boys. IQ tests conducted on children between 4 and 5 years old revealed a difference between girls in foster care and those in an orphanage, but showed no difference in case of boys. Girls in foster care scored an average of 82, while those who remained at the orphanage scored only 70. On the other hand, boys scored an average of 60 regardless of whether they were fostered. The average IQ score in the general population is around 100. Orphanhood has a negative impact on brain development. Parents do a lot more than make sure a child has food and shelter, researchers say. They play a critical role in brain development. More than a decade of research on children raised in institutions shows that neglect is awful for the brain, says Charles Nelson, a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital. Without someone who is a reliable source of attention, affection, and stimulation, he says, the wiring of the brain goes awry. The result can be long-term mental and emotional problems. When Nelson first visited the orphanages in 1999, he saw children in cribs rocking back and forth as if they had autism. He also saw toddlers desperate for attention. They'd reach their arms out as though they're saying to you, "Please pick me up," Nelson says. So you'd pick them up and they'd hug you. But then they'd push you away and they'd want to get down. And then the minute they got down, they'd want to be picked up again. It's a very disorganized way of interacting with somebody. The odd behaviors, delayed language, and a range of other symptoms suggested problems with brain development, Nelson says. So he and other researchers began studying the children using a technology known as electroencephalography, EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain. Many of the orphans had disturbingly low levels of brain activity. Instead of a 100-watt light bulb, it was a 40-watt light bulb, Nelson says. As the children grew older, the researchers were able to use MRI to study the anatomy of their brains. And once again, the results were troubling. We found a dramatic reduction in what's referred to as gray matter and in white matter, Nelson says. In other words, their brains were actually physically smaller. The scientists realized the cause wasn't anything as simple as malnutrition. It was a different kind of deprivation, the lack of a parent, or someone who acted like a parent. What about the moral characteristics of orphans? I haven't been able to find any studies suggesting that orphans are more sensitive or compassionate than non-orphans. From personal experience, I can say that my dad was an orphan, and the number of times I ever heard him show any concern for orphans was somewhere in the ballpark of 0. I also noticed from thousands of conversations with inmates in correctional institutions that almost none of the inmates ever shared stories about their fathers. Many of them shared stories about their mothers, but almost no one shared stories about their fathers. Do you know why that is? Because their fathers weren't around when they were growing up. Shouldn't these young men with missing fathers have become more sensitive and compassionate than young men from two-parent homes? They should have, according to the Yasir Qadhi theory of child development. Instead, many of them wouldn't think twice about cutting your throat. Now, just to be clear, if you grow up without a father, or you grow up as an orphan, this doesn't mean that you're going to be less educated or less intelligent or less compassionate than anyone else. You might end up winning multiple Nobel Prizes. There are tons of variables involved. So the point here isn't about individuals. The point is that statistically, looking at large numbers, the impact of orphanhood tends to be negative in several important ways, which means that it's not something you should want to impose on children as part of their upbringing. But Muhammad was orphaned, and Sheikh Qadhi believes that Allah was in control of this. So Sheikh Qadhi has to see this as positive, and this leads him to present a rosy picture of orphanhood. Once again, however, I have more respect for Allah than the Muslims who believe in him. I say that I have more respect for Allah than Sheikh Qadhi does because if we listen to Sheikh Qadhi, we have to conclude that Allah is completely ignorant of psychology. But if Allah created human beings and created our brains and wired us in specific ways, then Allah must know what He's doing. He must know the impact of taking away a child's father, then taking away his foster family, then taking away his mother, then taking away his grandfather. Allah knows what this will do to a child, and we know what this will do to a child, which means that we can know Allah's true intentions. Sheikh Qadhi believes that Muhammad's trials during childhood shaped his character.
So by putting the Prophet ﷺ through such difficult circumstances, this made him who he was. And he needed to be that man in order to be the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
So, from an Islamic perspective, what did Allah want Muhammad to become? It makes no sense to say that Allah orphaned Muhammad repeatedly in order to make him more sensitive, since being repeatedly orphaned doesn't make you more sensitive. But as we discussed in part 1, we do know the impact of losing a father or father figure at a young age. Based on the psychology of the defective father, we were able to predict that someone with Muhammad's childhood experiences would rebel against authority and tradition, would have a problem with father figures, and especially with viewing God as a heavenly father, and would have some difficulty forming normal relationships with other people. If statistically these tend to be the result of losing a father or father figure at a young age, wouldn't Allah know this? And if Allah knew this, can't we say that Allah's intention was to shape Muhammad into someone with these characteristics in order to promote Islam? Unlike Sheikh Qadhi, we're going to test our claims, and for the remainder of this discussion, we'll see if our hypothesis about Muhammad rebelling against authority and tradition is confirmed or disconfirmed. Let's start with a couple of passages from the history of At-Tabari. The History of At-Tabari, Volume 6, beginning on page 93. The messenger of God proclaimed God's message openly and declared Islam publicly to his fellow tribesmen. When he did so, they did not withdraw from him or reject him in any way, as far as I have heard, until he spoke of their gods and denounced them. When he did this, they took exception to it and united in opposition and hostility to him, except for those of them whom God had protected from error by means of Islam. Notice, when Muhammad preached Islam, they did not withdraw from him or reject him in any way until he spoke of their gods and denounced them. So the Quraysh had no problem with Muhammad preaching Islam. They only objected to him denouncing their gods. What did they do about it? They went to his uncle, Abu Talib, and said, "Abu Talib, your nephew has reviled our gods, denounced our religion, derided our traditional values, and told us that our forefathers were misguided. Either curb his attacks on us or give us a free hand to deal with him, for you are just as opposed to him as we are, and we will deal with him for you." Abu Talib gave them a mild answer and declined courteously, and they left him. The messenger of God continued as before, proclaiming the faith of God and summoning people to it. After a while, they complained again. "Abu Talib, you are our elder and our chief, so give us justice against your nephew and order him to desist from reviling our gods, and we will leave him to his God." Here again, they have no problem with Muhammad preaching his view of God. They object to Muhammad reviling their gods, and their only request is that he stop reviling their gods. The tension builds, and in another passage beginning on page 101, a Muslim asks a Muslim from Mecca about the worst attack by the Quraysh on Muhammad. This is the worst attack on Muhammad. I said to him, "What was the worst attack you saw by Quraysh upon the messenger of God when they openly showed their enmity to him?" He replied, "I was with them when their nobles assembled one day in the Hijr and discussed the messenger of God. They said, 'We have never seen the like of what we have endured from this man. He has derided our traditional values, abused our forefathers, reviled our religion, caused division among us, and insulted our gods.'" Does that sound like rebellion against authority and tradition? "We have endured a great deal from him," or words to that effect. While they were saying this, the messenger of God suddenly appeared and walked up and kissed the black stone. Then he passed by them while performing the circumambulation, and as he did so, they made some slanderous remarks about him. I could see from the messenger of God's face that he had heard them, but he went on. When he passed the second time, they made similar remarks, and I could see from his face that he had heard them, but again he went on. Then he passed them the third time, and they made similar remarks, but this time he stopped and said, "Hear, men of Quraysh, by him in whose hand Muhammad's soul rests, I have brought you slaughter." Muhammad promises to slaughter his own tribe. They were gripped by what he had said, and it was as though every man of them had a bird perched on his head. Even those of them who had been urging the severest measures against him previously spoke in a conciliatory way to him, using the politest expressions they could think of, and said, "Depart in true guidance, Abu al-Qasim. By God, you are never ignorant." The Prophet left, and the next day they gathered in the Hijr, and I was again present. They said to one another, "You were talking about the unpleasantness which you have endured and the things which Muhammad has done to you, but when he openly said something disagreeable, you shrank from him." While they were saying this, the messenger of God suddenly appeared, and they leapt upon him as one man and surrounded him, saying, "Is it you who says this and that?" repeating what they had heard of his denunciation of their gods and their religion. The Prophet said, "Yes, I am the one who says that." So he admits to reviling their gods and their religion. Then I saw one of them grabbing his cloak, but Abu Bakr stood in front of him, weeping and saying, "Woe upon you all! Would you kill a man because he says, 'My Lord is God'?" Then they left him, and that is the worst thing I ever saw Quraysh do to him. Think about this. The text says over and over again that the Quraysh had no problem with Muhammad believing in Allah alone and preaching Islam. They had a problem with Muhammad insulting their gods, reviling their religion, abusing their forefathers, and causing division. Muhammad did this for years, and they kept going to his uncle, asking Abu Talib to convince him to stop talking about their gods. In response, Muhammad promised to slaughter them. We just read it, I'm not making this up. One of them grabbed his cloak And Abu Bakr screamed, "Are you going to kill a man simply for believing in Allah?" Have you noticed that Islam often causes its adherents to interpret any objections to Islamic practices as simple objections to belief in Allah? Hey, I have a problem with marrying 6-year-old girls and female genital mutilation and raping female captives and violently subjugating non-Muslims and terrorist attacks in general. Why is David Wood persecuting us simply for believing in Allah? So, did Muhammad rebel against authority and tradition? Yes, the only exceptions were that he continued certain pagan practices, such as circling the Kaaba and kissing the black stone, but only because he could incorporate these pagan practices into his rebellion. But Muhammad wasn't satisfied with rebelling against authority and tradition. He also encouraged others to rebel against authority and tradition, unless the authority and tradition came from him. Of course, any prophet might say to his listeners, "Don't just believe what your parents believed, you need to put God first." But with Muhammad, this rises to the level of obsession, and the main obstacle to Islam turns out to be people trusting their fathers. Surah 2, verse 170. When it is said to them, the unbelievers, "Follow what Allah has sent down," they say, "Nay, we shall follow what we found our fathers following." What? Even though their fathers did not understand anything, nor were they guided? Surah 5, verse 104. And when it is said to them, "Come to what Allah has revealed and unto the messenger Muhammad," they say, "Enough for us is that which we found our fathers following," even though their fathers had no knowledge whatsoever and no guidance. Surah 7, verse 28. And when they commit an indecency, they say, "We found our fathers doing this, and Allah has enjoined it on us." Say, "Surely Allah does not enjoin indecency. Do you say against Allah what you do not know?" Surah 9, verse 23. O you who believe, do not take your fathers and your brothers for guardians if they love unbelief more than belief. And whoever of you takes them for a guardian, these it is that are the unjust. Surah 11, verse 109. So be not in doubt, O Muhammad, as to what these men worship. They worship nothing but what their fathers worshipped before them. And verily, we shall repay them in full their portion without diminution. Surah 31, verse 21. When they are told to follow the revelation that Allah has sent down, they say, "Nay, we shall follow the ways that we found our fathers following." What? Even if it is Satan beckoning them to the penalty of the blazing fire? Surah 34, verse 43. And when our clear verses are recited to them, they say, "This Muhammad is only a man who wishes to hinder you from that which your fathers used to worship." This message about not trusting fathers was the message of all prophets according to the Quran. Surah 43, verses 21 through 24. Or have we given them a book before it so that they hold fast to it? Nay, they say, "We found our fathers on a course, and surely we are guided by their footsteps. And thus we did not send before you any warner in a town, but those who led easy lives in it said, Surely we found our fathers on a course, and surely we are followers of their footsteps." The warner said, "What? Even if I bring you a better guide than that on which you found your fathers?" They said, "Surely we are unbelievers in that with which you are sent." Notice, Allah never sent a prophet who didn't tell people not to trust their fathers. And the Quran gives us numerous examples of these former prophets. We read about the Prophet Hud's discussion with unbelievers in Surah 7, verses 70 to 71. They said, "Have you come to us that we may serve Allah alone and give up what our fathers used to serve? Then bring to us what you threaten us with, if you are the truthful ones." He said, "Indeed, uncleanness and wrath from your Lord have lighted upon you. What? Do you dispute with me about names which you and your fathers have given? Allah has not sent any authority for them. Wait then. I too, with you, will be of those who wait." When the Prophet Saleh preaches to the people of Thamud, they reply in Surah 11, verse 62, "O Saleh, surely you are one amongst us in whom great expectations were placed before this. Do you now forbid us from worshipping what our fathers worshipped?" Abraham speaks to his people in Surah 21. We read in verses 52 to 54, when he said to his father and his people, "What are these images to which you are devoted?" They said, "We found our fathers worshipping them." He said, "Indeed, you and your fathers have been in manifest error." We find a similar passage in Surah 26, verses 70 to 76. When he, Abraham, said to his father and his people, "What do you worship?" They said, "We worship idols, and to them we are ever devoted." He said, "Do they hear you when you call, or do they profit you or cause you harm?" They said, "Nay, but we found our fathers doing so." He said, "Have you then considered what you have been worshiping, you and your fathers before you?" In Surah 12, verse 40, Joseph says to his fellow prisoners in Egypt, "If not him, you worship nothing but names which you have named, you and your fathers, for which Allah has sent down no authority." In Surah 11, verse 87, the Midianites respond to the prophet Shu'aib, presumably Jethro, "O Shu'aib, does your prayer enjoin you that we should forsake what our fathers worshipped, or that we should not do what we please with regard to our property?" In Surah 10, verse 78, Pharaoh and his chiefs reply to Moses, "Have you come to turn us away from the ways we found our fathers following, in order that you and your brother may have greatness in the land?" In Surah 14, verse 10, Moses tells the Jews about the message of the prophets before him. Their messengers said, "Is there doubt about Allah, the maker of the heavens and the earth? He invites you to forgive you your faults and to respite you till an appointed term." They said, "You are nothing but mortals like us. You wish to turn us away from what our fathers used to worship. Bring us, therefore, some clear authority." The main task of all prophets, according to Muhammad, the orphan with a psychological need to rebel against authority and tradition, seems to be convincing people not to listen to their fathers. This is interesting because the vast majority of Muslims only believe in Islam because it's what their parents taught them. Nevertheless, convincing people to rebel against their parents and culture usually doesn't go over too well. So, not surprisingly, Muhammad had to flee Mecca. The Meccans couldn't have been happier. Once he was gone, they could go on practicing their religion and traditions. Muhammad was safe hundreds of miles away in Medina. He and his followers could work and worship Allah and learn the Quran in peace. But Muhammad didn't want to live in peace, so he started robbing the Meccan caravans. Muhammad knew that the people of Mecca depended on these caravans. Anyone who had any money would invest it, hoping to get back something extra to feed their families. If the caravan didn't return, some people would starve. So Muhammad started attacking these caravans. The attacks eventually led to war with Mecca. Muhammad won the war when he conquered Mecca, seized the Kaaba, and smashed the 360 idols worshipped by the pagans of Arabia. His tribe, the Quraysh, was forced to submit to him. So, Muhammad attacked his own people theologically, socially, morally, economically, and militarily. And he won. Therefore, if you're a Muslim and you ask,
why did Allah Azza wa Jal put three orphan situations, three traumatic trials, one after the other, upon our Prophet?
The correct answer from an Islamic perspective is not, "I guess Allah wanted to make Muhammad more sensitive." The correct answer from an Islamic perspective is that Allah wanted to turn Muhammad into the ultimate weapon for destroying cultures, and in order to do that, he had to crush Muhammad emotionally and psychologically. But this isn't all that Allah wanted to do with Muhammad. In our next video, The Psychology of Islam Part 3, Theology of the Fatherless, we'll see how Allah's psychological experiments on Muhammad led Muhammad to react violently to the Judeo-Christian view of God as our Heavenly Father. So, in X-Men movie terms, Allah is the theological equivalent of Dr. Xander Rice, director of Alkali Transigan, the company that creates the soulless Wolverine clone X-24 to annihilate its enemies. X-24 is the 24th experiment, which makes the prior experiments obsolete. Of course, in the Quran, Muhammad, the seal of the prophets, is the 25th prophet mentioned by name, so he should technically be Allah's X25. Or if we go with P for prophet, he was Allah's P25. For the sake of clarity, we'll now refer to Muhammad as P25 when we're discussing Allah's psychological experiments.
If Allah had willed, he could have had loving parents until he became a prophet, or at least until he became a young man and an adult. Allah has a plan. Allah has a plan.